From New York City, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is the One Way Ticket Show. Hello and welcome once again to another episode of the show where we explore with our guests where they'd go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back. Their destinations may be in the past, present, future, real, imaginary, even a state of mind, but once again, the only caveat, there's no coming back. Now, we thank you for watching us here on our YouTube channel, where we have selected best of episodes from over the years, plus new ones as well, just like this one. And just so you never miss any of our fantastic conversations, make sure you subscribe by ringing that bell on your screen. Plus, you can also listen to the show on our website, theenewayticketshow.com, or you can also listen wherever you like to download your podcast. And while you're at it, do rate and review us there to make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. And also one more point of housekeeping, if you haven't done so already, do follow the show and yours truly on all social media. Just search for The One Way Ticket Show and search for Stephen Shalowitz. All right, as for this episode, we're joined in the studio by Natalya Murakhver, a documentary filmmaker, writer, and co-founder of Restore Childhood. It's a nonprofit organization focused on children's education, health, and parental rights advocacy. Now, when New York City schools closed during the pandemic, she co-founded #Keep NYC Schools Open and filed a lawsuit against then-Mayor Bill de Blasio to reopen the schools. Well, that fight became 15 Days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures. It's a forensic documentary investigation into how and why America's children were locked out of their schools and what it cost them. It's a fascinating documentary. I recommend that you see it, and you can catch it on Google Play, Amazon, Apple TV, and YouTube as well. You will thank me later for watching it. And Natalya joins us now in studio. Natalya, congratulations on the documentary, and thanks so much for joining us here on the One Way Ticket Show.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen.
Well, we're going to be diving into the documentary in just a sec, but of course I have to begin our conversation, as I do, with all of our guests here on the program, which I've done for over 14 years right now. So, Natalya, if I gave you a one-way ticket, past, present, future, real, imaginary, even a state of mind, it's the question that I ask all my guests. Natalya Murakhver, where would you go?
The 1980s.
I like that. Why the 1980s? In the 1980s here in New York, or where?
Yeah, in Brooklyn, where I grew up. Well, I was an immigrant. I came here in 1977. I was 6 years old at the time.
From the former Soviet Union.
From the former Soviet Union, yes, from Odesa. And by the 1980s, I had acquired English, so I was starting to feel like an American. And I was really, I think, enjoying the pop culture. I was really immersed in Motown music, Michael Jackson. I mean, it was a golden age of pop. And great films, whether they were critically great, that's, arguable. But I was watching uplifting films like Fame and Flashdance and Rocky, films that told an immigrant kid that they could be anyone, and it didn't matter how humble their beginnings. It was really, to me, the age of hope and promise.
How great is that? Don't you think that music and the arts in general were really better then than now? I don't know, maybe I don't want to sound like an old fogey or anything like that, but I just think the music scene was so much better, and the movies were just more fun.
They were, and more simple. Right? I mean, it was more about the story, right? Rather than the fancy graphics or, technology, which you saw some of that in films like Star Wars or more sci-fi films. But I think that the heroes and the heroines back then were pretty clear-cut and had a real moral compass that was easy to watch and aspire to. I think things have really spiraled out of control these days. And also with music, too. It's just so noisy. I was just listening to the Thriller album with my family over the weekend. My husband insisted on playing the entire album in sequence, like all the songs. And it's just incredible. I mean, your brain, I think, is in a different state listening to that music than it is like, current pop, which is just dizzying in my opinion.
Would you want to be your age now, back in the 80s? Or would you want to be the age that you were in the 80s?
I've been thinking about that. I don't know. I mean, it's hard because I would never leave my family behind, so I take them with me. So I guess I would have to be my age, but it would be nice to be able to relive those years as a young teenager with the knowledge I have now. I think I would have savored it a lot more.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, what would you like to tell folks back in the 1980s about our time today? And what do you think they would make of anything that you would share with them?
That's interesting. That's a really interesting question. Well, for one thing, and I say this as not a particularly religious person, I would tell them to hold on to their God because this is the age of the destruction of the monotheistic belief, like the destruction of Christianity and Judaism. I think we've had years of assault on our God. And I say this as a pretty agnostic person, so it's a strange thing coming from my lips. But in the absence of that God, I think we've had a lot of questionable ideologies that have taken root in our culture and our psyches. So I would probably tell people back then, continue to go to church, continue to go to synagogue, but also read the ancient texts.
I feel like the 1980s were a time where things weren't as politicized. The far left and the far right. I mean, people on either sides of the equation would speak, and there really wasn't so much difference between the two. Now everything is just so polarized.
Well, there was no social media. Things moved much more slowly. I think, first of all, people were reading books and newspapers. There was a TV that the entire family gathered in front of. It wasn't all these personal devices. So I think, unfortunately, with all the siloing that we've seen with all the personal devices and the technology, and also people, no longer reading books or taking the time to think about what they're saying and how they're writing it. Everything is jargon and lingo, and that's what, has given rise to all of this. So yeah, I think that's definitely true. That said, my parents are Republicans, and I went to a conservative Jewish day school in the 80s, and I told my class that I was a Reagan supporter, and that didn't go over well. So it was still kind of politicized.
It was, but at least they probably still spoke to you.
They never spoke to me anyway, so I was kind of like, but it didn't get any worse.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Is there anything then, you just invoked social media, is there anything then that you would like to show people from our time today, like an iPhone, for example? And again, what do you think that they would make of it?
I don't know. I mean, we talked about convergence, even just 10 or 20 years later. So I think there was an anticipation of all of this. I don't know that I would want to bring any of these things back. I think that there was this singularity of the experience. I think people shared more similar experiences than they do now. And I think I would want to leave them to their innocence.
I agree, because there was more of a collective experience around, say, for example, pop culture, around television shows, around music, because there wasn't as much to consume.
Right.
So everyone was consuming almost the same thing,
Right.
and you can have a conversation about that. Whereas today, there is so much out there. You can speak to XYZ person, and you have no idea about the TV shows or the music that they're even talking about.
Yeah, and it's an illusion of choice, right? It seems like there's so many choices, but actually, if you scroll through the different channels or the streaming channels, it's a lot of schlock, And
It is.
I'd rather have a little bit of the good than a lot of the bad, and I think there's still gems to be found for sure, and also podcasts like this, conversations that are long form. I was a huge viewer and fan of Charlie Rose back then. I mean, and he had this incredible show on PBS where he would invite, it was not in the 80s, probably more like in the 90s and 2000s, but it would be a very long form, quiet conversation with one guest where they'd sit in a black room with a black table, and it was just the two of them or three of them talking about the book, the political event, the moment in history, and that type of conversation I think I'd like to see more of.
I agree. Well, that's the good thing about podcasting, right? Is that we can have long-form conversations. And that's why I love the medium so much, actually, and why I've embraced it. Just one or two more points on your one-way ticket destination, then we're going to talk about your fantastic documentary. It seems that in the 80s, there was such great hope for the Soviet Union. There was such great hope for China, and as a China specialist, I can say that. And as someone who was there actually in the 80s, I can definitely attest to that. And I wonder if you can share any thoughts really on sort of that arc from the 80s until today and these countries and the hope that they really had for the countries and for their people. I mean, certainly things have gotten better for the average Chinese person since the 80s, at least economically, but politically, no. Soviet Union turned into Russia, and we know how that's gone.
I've not been back to this. Well, Ukraine is where I would have gone back to. I mean, the USSR, which is on my passport, no longer exists.
You mean in terms of your place of birth?
Yeah, exactly. It's my place of birth. My husband laughs about this. He's like, the place you're born, like there, it doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of fascinating. It really, I think you pointed this out. This really was a one-way ticket. I am on my way.
You are on your one-way ticket to the United States. You had no choice,
Yes.
but I'm sure you're very happy that it happened.
I am really happy that it happened. I mean, I don't know. I don't really think so much about the back home. I will say that the USSR, the Russia, whatever it is now, doesn't have a lot of Jews. Jews tend to be the canaries in the coal mine, and we left in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and that's not a good sign for a country.
Right.
A country that is mostly devoid of Jews is not a good country.
Yeah, there are still a considerable amount of Jews in, say, for example, Moscow.
Yeah.
Certainly not what it was
Right.
at its height, but of course many of them left.
Yeah.
So there you go. Final thing, is the 1980s something you've thought about going back to long before I even asked this question?
Well, we go back to it every time we're in the car because we listen to
You mean music-wise?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm not hallucinating. No, we only listen to 80s on 8 or like yacht rock. So the kids enjoy it too. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it wasn't an easy time for me personally. Like, I was at a school, my English was developing, I was a little weird and didn't have a lot of friends. So socially, it was awkward. But I do have a lot of nostalgia for that time. And whenever we have an opportunity to watch a movie together as a family, do tend to recycle the 80s films. And yeah, I think I've thought about it quite a bit. I mean, musically, I was incredibly influenced by Motown and Michael Jackson in particular. I was obsessed. And I had all the albums and the posters wallpapered my walls, and it gave me somebody to look up to. It was like a North Star. I was all about, music and Michael Jackson in particular. And so, yeah, I've thought about those days. It feels really, really innocent. The other thing that we did that my parents and I were able to do, other than visit Disney World for the first time, and it was one of our first trips in this country, was spend time in the Catskills in the Borscht Belt. And I really enjoyed very simple, like we stayed at a very simple hotel where everybody really socialized together. It was a lot of former Soviet immigrants and kids like me, and I made a lot of friends. And, the nature compared to, Brooklyn's pavements, and hot streets. It was a nice, simple time. We didn't really have very much, but I think everything was appreciated.
Nice. Well, you'll send us a postcard from the 1980s. Thank you for taking us down memory lane right there, Natalya. But listen, before we talk about the documentary, I want you to highlight the organization that you co-founded, Restore Childhood. Share with our wonderful audience really what it's all about. I gave a little bit of a hint, certainly in your introduction.
Yeah, so I co-founded Restore Childhood in 2022. It was during the height of the mandates. Schools were still closed in certain parts of the country or just reopened. In New York, they reopened in 2020, and we sued to have them opened without Zoom in a room because many schools still had technology in the room and the teachers were not there. They were teaching remotely. That's a whole other conversation. But kids were masked, and there were vaccine mandates for kids to participate in after-school activities, sports. So that kind of shut all the public school kids who wanted to do sports and get scouted for sports scholarships. If their parents couldn't or wouldn't consent to them getting the COVID shots specifically, they were locked out and kind of robbed of their futures. So, we saw an opportunity to communicate directly with parents. Parents in New York City or anywhere else really didn't have a seat at the table. The unions, the teachers' unions in particular, had, all the power. It had been made pretty clear in an expose by Fox and the New York Post that the teachers' unions had meddled in the school reopening guidelines. Parents were not consulted. Anytime parents, tried to advocate for school reopenings or for all these mitigations to be ended and for kids to go back to normal, we were called racists and white supremacists. They'd said that we didn't care about our kids. All we wanted was a babysitter, which was obviously not true. We wanted our kids to be back, in normal situations with their teachers, with other students. And so we introduced this toolkit for parents called Urgency of Normal in 2022. I developed it with epidemiologist Tracy Beth Hogue, with some epidemiologists and infectious disease experts around the country. We released it directly to parents, and it was an evidence-based, non-political toolkit that gave parents the depoliticized information, like were masks really helpful, were vaccine mandates required or helpful for their children, and what they could say and give out to their school board or their teachers to advocate for their kids, but from a place of, knowledge and authority. And when that toolkit got released, we had no idea how it would be received, but the doctors ended up getting op-eds and media placement all over the country, mostly conservative media because mainstream really didn't want anything to do with us, but enough that there was a real buzz, and parents were contacting me from around the country saying, thank you, you finally gave us something that we can use to advocate with, even in our true blue district. It didn't matter where they were. They felt confident giving this to a school board and advocating and demanding that their kids go back to normal. And I even heard from parents from around the world, like Italy, Germany, France, because the same thing was happening in all the countries. And so we realized that we really needed to create a resource for parents that spoke directly to parents. And that's, the organization we started, it's a nonprofit. It's called Restore Childhood, and that is how the film got produced as well.
And give a shout out to the website, because you're still around.
Yeah. Oh, yes. We're very much around. We're actually about to release another film and are in pre-production on a third. It's restorechildhood.com, and it's got links to our Substack, which is really the place where we post most articles and interviews and new content.
And we'll have links to all that on our show notes pages on all of our platforms when we release this. And so I have to really commend you, because you are a mom of 2 children. And how old were they during the pandemic? Remind us.
My younger daughter was 5 when schools closed, and my older daughter was 9 at the time.
And so you took this on yourself. This is real citizen advocacy, isn't it?
I couldn't stop myself.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I'm really not that political a person. I'm idea-driven, but not so political. And I don't really go to rallies or marches or participate in any kind of political advocacy. But when schools shut down, I was one of the first ones at the rallies demanding that it just was so clear that there was nobody who was going to advocate for our kids. Every single one of us should have been there. And parents are the best advocates for their own kids and for other kids as well.
Yeah, and I mentioned at the top of the program in your introduction that you sued former Mayor Bill de Blasio. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we first, in November 2020, when schools were being threatened to be shut down. So just to backtrack a little bit, schools did reopen in New York City at the end of September 2020. De Blasio negotiated with the unions. He seemed, as awful a mayor as he seemed genuinely interested in reopening the schools. But the contract or the agreement he negotiated was terrible, and it gave a very low transmission threshold as like the impetus for closure again. And so by November 2020, when kids were back in school, alternate weeks, like it was 2 days, 1 week, 3 days, another week, fully masked, distanced, horrible mitigations, but still back in school, better than nothing. In November 2020, it was clear that he was going to shut them down again because the unions demanded it, because New York City was reaching this 5% threshold, which was meaningless, but that's what it was. And he was going to shut down schools again. So we organized something called Keep NYC Schools Open. And it was first started by a woman named Daniela Jampel, who had written a petition, which got thousands and thousands of signatures demanding that schools not close a second time. And we organized the first rally in November 2020. None of that made a dent. Like mainstream media didn't even come. The only ones who came mostly were the New York Post and like Fox News. Mainstream media pretended that we didn't even exist, and except for derogatory coverage by the New York Times, of course. But when it was clear that rally after rally was really not changing anything, I suggested a lawsuit. And some of the other parents, and by the way, I was a very progressive New York City Democrat. I voted for Obama twice and demanded that my parents vote for him, which was really, I was so aggressive about it too. Very, very obnoxious. And I voted for Biden in 2020. So I was really dug into the Democratic Party. And the other parents I was advocating with, moms mostly, were all Democrats as well. And I said, it looks like nothing is changing here and we're going to have to sue to reopen these schools, because eventually the elementary schools reopened that year or in early 2021, but middle and high schools continued to stay closed or reopened with Zoom in a room, which was horrible for these students because they were in rooms looking at laptops. Their teachers weren't there. They were teaching from home in their yoga pants and the kids were masked. It was a terrible situation. So nobody was really interested in a lawsuit. And honestly, there weren't very many attorneys who were interested in taking one because most law firms, I've since learned, lean to the left, and this was seen as a conservative right-wing thing, like to fight to reopen schools, which of course it wasn't. And everybody I talked to across the country was mostly on the left side anyway. So there was an attorney who agreed after persistent like badgering on my part to take on this case. And he was actually a Trump supporter from Long Island who had sued Governor Cuomo to reopen strip clubs and gyms and restaurants and was successful. The New Yorker even had written an article about him. And he finally, when he heard that kids were being forced to stare into Zoom screens, said, "What? Okay, I'll take the case." And like he was so incensed because his girls were in a private school in Long Island and they didn't even have to wear masks. And he was like, "This is what New York City's doing. I'll do this." So he took the case and we filed a lawsuit in the spring of 2021, and it didn't even get heard until after school let out in July of 2021, and it was supposed to be an emergency motion.
And then what was the outcome?
The outcome was by then schools had shut down for the summer. They said that they had planned to reopen fully in the fall without any Zoom in a room and without any remote option, which is what we were fighting against. We wanted to make sure there would always be teachers in classrooms and kids would be in classrooms from, 5 days a week, every day. The mayor's office said, yes, that's what we're planning to do. But if there's another variant, it's still within our, jurisdiction to shut them down. And the judge, who was a very progressive judge in, I think, New York State Court or Supreme Court, I can't remember, was like, well, I read the evidence and the research in the New York Times this morning, and there is a new variant. So, we have to leave it with the Department of Education, the mayor's office. If they don't reopen the schools, then you guys can come back and try to sue again. But, I think this case is moot but you know what? I consider it a victory because it gave pressure to the mayor's office to fully reopen schools. There was a lawsuit on the books. Nobody else had a lawsuit. We had, I think, 20 plaintiffs. I had to turn plaintiffs away by the end of the lawsuit. There were so many people who were like, I'll sue, I'll put my name on this. And unfortunately, there is a very sad story that came out from it. One of the plaintiffs, her daughter tried to kill herself. Fortunately, she was unsuccessful. I don't know how she's doing now, but I hope she's doing well. And another plaintiff's son did actually kill himself a year ago. The film is actually dedicated to him, Noah. And, the school closures were so devastating to him. He never recovered. He didn't have sports. He didn't have school. He didn't have his friends. And, these kids can't just come back and be, what they were beforehand, especially if they were even remotely struggling before that. So, yes, the lawsuit was important. I think it put pressure on the mayor's office. It gave us publicity and gave parents an opportunity to know that there was somebody fighting. And, we'll be able to tell our kids that we fought for them.
And you tried to do something. You didn't just sit there at the sidelines.
Right.
And that's really an important lesson for kids.
Yeah. And I wasn't scared off. And they tried to scare me off with, oh, your lawyer's just a Trumper. I mean, Gothamist came to cover the filing of the lawsuit. They met us downtown at the courts. We had a press conference. And the first question they asked our lawyer was, so you're a Trumper, right? And that may sound extreme, today in 2026 or, whatever, but in 2021, that was poison. Like throwing that in New York City, in downtown New York City in 2021, you're a Trumper, forget it. And it was like, how offensive. Like this guy, why can't we just talk about the issue at hand? This has nothing to do with Trump. We're talking about reopening New York City schools. This is the only lawyer who would take this case. And in fact, there were parents who contacted me all around the country saying, how'd you get a lawyer? How'd you get a lawyer? No lawyer lawyer wants to take this case. And it was true. So we were lucky. And I think that, it's important for people to know that you can't wait for somebody else to take an action. If there's an action to take, you should take it, or it may not happen.
You got to take the bull by the horns, as they say. And then so from that, 15 days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures came about. Again, congrats on the documentary, and I really recommend that everybody has a look at it and really absorbs the content. And then take us then how that manifested.
So after we filed the lawsuit, had the hearing, the masks still stayed on the kids.
And the adults in so many places.
And the adults.
Drove me nuts going to the gym and being expected to wear a mask while I'm working out when someone else is on the other side of the room.
Women were giving birth in masks. Yeah, I mean, there are really horrible stories.
Just as a total aside, before we get to the film, Natalya, the other day, and I don't want to mention which box office it was, but I went to a box office to buy a ticket to the theater. There was a glass between the person giving out the ticket and me, and the person had a mask around her chin. I approached, and mind you, there was glass, and she put the mask back on when she was speaking to me.
So sad.
I'm at a loss for words. Why would you wear a mask just because you're speaking to me when there's glass between us?
It's so sad. We really broke people.
We really did.
But I have to say that's mostly true in blue areas of this country, because as someone who's traveled outside of New York and outside of the United States quite extensively, mostly to Europe, but
you don't see that
anywhere.
Yeah, you don't see that.
Never seen anything like it.
So anyway, going back to the documentary.
Yeah.
Just a little commercial there from yours truly.
No, it's really bad. I mean, now with Ebola and whatever else, hantavirus, they're all like masking up again, and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, your question was about the film, how that came about. So I've always been interested in film. I went to NYU undergrad for English and writing, and my favorite class at NYU was the films of Scorsese and Coppola. I was, 18 years old. I was obsessed. I was just like, these directors create a universe. Like, exactly what the rules are. The characters are so robust. Many of those films took place in New York City, and the grittiness was actually something you liked. They made grittiness like glamorous, which was nice considering I lived in Brooklyn. It was like boom boxes everywhere. And
did you ever find the glamour in all that?
Maybe just being downtown, at NYU in my teens, that was, I think I really did appreciate it. It was gritty. I was okay with that. It was predictably gritty, very different from what it is now. But I was always interested in film. And so at about 20, I got an internship at Disney at Buena Vista Pictures Marketing, which was in New York City at the time. And I interned there for the release of Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. It was like the golden age of Disney, too. Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg were running the studio back then. There were all these great films. Pretty Woman had just come out. It was just a really special time to be there. And then after I graduated from college, I went to LA because I thought, I need to get a job here. I need to write scripts. I need to do something. But I didn't really like it that much. It was right after OJ murdered Nicole. I lived in West LA, right by Brentwood. Like, there was blood on the, sidewalk, and there were always like paparazzi everywhere. And I remember the white Bronco chase that was right off the 405 right by my house. Then the earthquake, the fires, the floods, the mudslides. I was like, this is apocalyptic. No film industry's worth this. I'm going back to the snow. And so I came back to New York, and I was like, this is fine. I'm here. I'm not going back to LA ever except to visit, and I still feel that way. But I think film was always in my soul, and I had some jobs in film. I ended up working at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU for several years in the early 2000s in development, fundraising, and I got to meet Scorsese, which was the greatest thrill, and I got to meet Tony Kushner, in my opinion, the greatest playwright ever. For me, Angels in America was transformative. I've seen it multiple times on Broadway. So it was and that's a play, obviously not a film, but also a film on HBO, but I always loved film. And as a Jew, knowing what Steven Spielberg did with the Shoah Foundation and how he had preserved the stories of the Holocaust survivors, during, these very critical periods where, he knew that there wasn't a lot of time left, that they were getting old and the stories would die with them. That was something that really changed me too, thinking about it in those terms. And when schools reopened and people were still trying to figure out their footing, I think we really need to preserve these stories, because the people who did it are certainly going to try to rewrite history. And if there isn't an artifact that's really the true story of what happened, and how, people like Jay Bhattacharya, the scientist at Stanford who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, if we don't have these stories about how these people fought and how they were silenced, we'll be silenced again. So it'll be a crime committed twice.
In the film, you raise a couple of very interesting questions, one of which was it the virus or special interests that were keeping the schools closed? And then the battle wasn't against the virus, but was against those manipulating the crisis for their own ends. And I'm wondering if you can unpack both of those thoughts.
Yeah, this is something that we didn't really understand, and I think it's taken years to really see what happened. But in March 2020, progressive activists, including the heads of the teachers' unions, met with Jane Fonda and other NGOs like climate justice organizations, and they put it all on YouTube. Like, this was not hidden, it just wasn't publicized. And they talked about how to use the crisis to change society. Randi Weingarten, who's the head of the second largest teachers union in the country, the AFT, said that we're going to use this to create the society we want to see, and talked about elections and political, goals. And I never heard her speak that way before. Like, back in 2020, 21, 22, all of the media hits that she did were about trying to reopen schools, anticipate students' needs, teachers' needs. There was a lot of talk of equity, which at the time I didn't really fully understand, because I think we often conflate equity with equality, and they're actually opposites. But I didn't realize how this pandemic was being used by the unions to keep schools closed longer so that they could reap the federal subsidies that they got, which was a total of about $189.5 billion over the course of, less than a year, to reopen schools, but also to win elections, to change, to remove President Trump and end that first term, make sure that President Trump didn't have a second term. It wasn't about the fear of the virus. I think that they were thrilled about the virus.
So what you're saying is that they wanted the money so that they could impact elections.
They wanted the money and they wanted to impact elections. I think it's both. I think that, making people dissatisfied and unhappy and trying to blame President Trump for his pandemic handling helped them to present candidates that they approved of, including Biden, who made all these fantastic promises. He said, I'll reopen all schools within 100 days of taking office. And then once he took office, his press secretary, Jen Psaki, said, when we said we'll reopen schools within 100 days of taking office, we meant every school at least one day a week. Which, of course, by then, most schools were open one day a week. That was garbage. So, yes, I think the teachers' unions were looking for that money, and that was a huge payout for them. I think it was like triple the annual education budget. But they also wanted to change the federal and, state administrations.
So in the documentary, you featured up that Zoom call that you just referenced. It happened on March 26, 2020. As you said, Randi Weingarten was in there. You also mentioned that Jane Fonda was in there. She's in the film. And do share with our wonderful audience what Jane Fonda said during this meeting. I mean, she pops up at this meeting, of all people.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that, when I set out to make this film, my job was to go around the country and interview parents, doctors, children, free speech advocates. I wasn't thinking about the post-production. I wasn't thinking about the archival material that we would find later on when we were actually putting all of those things together. So I made this film not knowing any of this, right? I didn't know about the Zoom call. I didn't know about what Jane Fonda said, which I'll say in a minute. I just made it to preserve their stories. In post-production, I was working with my producer, Hawk Jensen, who's a veteran producer of film documentaries. One day he called me as he was doing some research and he said, I found this Zoom call from March 2020 that you have to watch. I said, okay. And so we start watching it together and we see what Randi Weingarten is saying about elections. And she said this virus is going to fundamentally change our lives. Wow. I was like, fundamentally change our lives? March 2020? Who knew that? I was like sterilizing my groceries and not allowing my 50-year-old husband to leave the house. Like fundamentally change our lives is supposed to be 2 weeks to slow the spread. So that was already like an alarm bell. But then there's this person in this video. Well, actually, no. So Jane Fonda was actually in that video. She didn't say it in that video. So Jane Fonda was in that Zoom call. And as my producer and I watched that Zoom call, I said to him, is that Jane Fonda in that call? And he was like, oh, I thought she looked familiar. I was like, that's Jane Fonda. What's Jane Fonda doing in the Zoom call with the teachers unions? And it turned out it was all these huge NGOs. It was like this huge, all these squares of different NGOs, environmental justice, social justice, Jane Fonda, Randi Weingarten, and they were trying to figure out how to use the virus. Well, as we started doing some more research, I said, what else did Jane Fonda say around this time? And it turns out, right around the height of the COVID virus, Jane Fonda slipped up in a Zoom call. It was released to the public, but she said, COVID is God's gift to the left, and cackled to herself. That was shocking. I kind of think of Jane Fonda as an activist, but I didn't think that, that is so diabolical. We had people dying. Randi Weingarten is right. It did fundamentally change our lives. And there's Jane Fonda kind of like frothing at the mouth about COVID.
And yet, as you also point out in the documentary, the CDC in March of 2020 actually had guidance on the pandemic.
Yeah.
But it was tossed out.
Yeah, there was a pandemic playbook. It was very much about focused protection. We were never supposed to shut down society for this long. Scott Atlas, who was an epidemiologist, a cardiologist from Stanford, was actually President Trump's COVID czar for a few months in 2020, 2021. And he tried to communicate that to President Trump. He was thwarted by Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. But he did try to tell President Trump that there was a better way. And the way was kind of what Sweden did, was not shut down society for this long and to release young people to go back to normal as quickly as possible while protecting the elderly and the infirm.
Right. And we knew that from Katrina, when schools were closed, that it had a negative effect on students.
Yes, exactly. We had the privilege of interviewing former NPR education journalist Anya Kamenetz, who told us about reporting from Katrina. She was one of the few progressive voices who actually was writing about the damage and the harm of school closures. There weren't many, but she was one of them. And the reason, she told us in the film, the reason she knew was because she had reported from New Orleans during Katrina and saw that the school shutdowns, even for a few months, scattered kids around the country like dice. Many of the kids never went back to school, and it really hurt, especially the most vulnerable children who really needed to be in classrooms.
And long term, how has this really impacted kids?
I think there's so many things happening at the same time. The school closures, I think, really showed kids that we didn't care about them. The kids came last. They were also shown that society thought they were viral vectors. They were constantly being told not to kill grandma, not to go around grandma, that they were being used by us to protect the elderly, which is the other way around. I think that kids have suffered on so many levels. The NAEP scores, their math and reading scores have really suffered. Also, education has been dumbed down since then. The teachers' unions took every opportunity to remove standardized tests and any sort of metrics that we used to use to analyze a good from a failing school and a good from a failing student. But mental health has suffered greatly. And in part, that is because when the kids went back to schools, they weren't the same schools they left. We had all these social emotional learning programs that basically told kids that they were victims and that it coddled the suffering rather than told them, you can do this, lift up and move forward and not wallow. Abigail Schreier writes about this quite a bit, about, the victim mentality, and that the schools these days really perpetuate that.
And it was so sad, all the athletes, for example, that couldn't train
Right.
And because they couldn't train, what did that do to their sport and the potential to get, say, for example, a scholarship?
Right. So they couldn't train. I mean, we interviewed one young athlete who ended up having to repeat his senior year and never actually got scouted for a football scholarship. So he's had a he's had a good outcome because he was able to go to a community college and is a good student and has a very strong family life. So I mean, even with all of that, he's persisted and triumphed. But so many kids were lost from the school system and never went back and gained so much weight. And we know that weight is very predictive of future health problems and lifespan. So I think they'll be damaged for forever.
And during that period, we also saw the George Floyd riots.
Yeah.
And it's worth talking about that because schools were closed, houses of worship were closed, yet people could congregate to protest out on the street. And by the way, and parks were closed. I mean, my hometown Chicago, Lori Lightfoot closed the lakeshore parks.
Yeah. And beaches were closed.
Beaches were closed, yeah.
All outdoor places that should have been open and welcoming, and yet people could protest together. You know, I'm ashamed to say that back then I kind of supported the George Floyd protests and had really bought into the narrative that this country was structurally racist and there was nothing that could be done other than breaking everything down. I don't know how I bought into it, but I did. And I was like, well, what are they supposed to do? Like, nobody's listening, so we have to do this. And I didn't even see the hypocrisy of it. So I think people can be very blinded to these things. But yes, I mean, if you had the right political persuasion, you were allowed to, in fact, encouraged to gather. But for kids, their lives were really circumspect.
Indeed. So, Natalya, can you do a little bit of a deep dive for yours truly, as well as for our wonderful audience, on the teachers union itself? Maybe how has it changed since it was founded? Where is it today? And really the power that it has. We've kind of touched on it, but I'd love you to expand a little bit more.
Yeah, you know, there's one part of the film that I would change. If I could, if I, had the budget and I could go back to editing, which I don't want to do and I'm not going to. But there's a line that Maud Marin, who was a former school board member here in New York City and a public school mom of four, very savvy attorney, says, she says, I genuinely believe that the teachers' unions thought it was in their members' best interests to keep schools closed. I want you to think about that. It was never in their members' best interests to keep schools closed. There have been research studies done on teachers who went back to teaching earlier. And as you could imagine, anyone who went back to normal society, teachers who want to be with their students, they went into teaching for a good reason, obviously do not want to be home behind a Zoom screen. It seems great, maybe for 15 days, but think about it for a year. This is not an honest living, and it's not impacting the next generation in the way that you want to be doing, which is why you went into this line of work in the first place. I don't believe that the teachers' unions represent teachers. I think teachers are their products, and they use them during the pandemic. Now, the teachers' unions started as a collective, an organization that was representing young women mostly who were vulnerable and, being exploited by the public school system. I think it was an honorable thing to do back then to help them, negotiate better contracts, working conditions that would also improve the learning conditions of the students. That's not what they are at this point. Why do you see Randi Weingarten, the head of the AFT, traveling to every single area that is affected by war or any kind of political disaster these days? You see her in China. You saw her in Ukraine. You saw her in Israel after October 7th. How is that the role of a teachers union head? She's not a teachers union head. She's a politician. She's a global change maker. She controls trillions of dollars of pensions that come in from both her teacher union members and her healthcare union members. I think the number is $4 trillion worth of pensions. Most people don't know that. I mean, the $189.5 billion they negotiated to reopen the schools. One of the payments came during the Trump administration, the other two during the Biden administration, $189.5 billion. That's kind of a drop in the bucket compared to how much money they control. They know the teachers' unions know that the way to change this country and to change society, like Randi Weingarten said in that Zoom call, which was very, very revelatory, is to really change young minds and to be able to shape young minds. And the radical changes we've seen in public schools, it's almost become like a bait and switch. Like the education you and I had, in our 40s and 50s now and back, in the 70s and 80s is very different than what kids are learning now. And the values that are being imparted in those schools are very, very different. Nobody got a note home. No parent got a text saying, hey, your schools have changed so much. Here's how they've changed. This is all done very, very swiftly and very silently. And much of it happened during the COVID pandemic. They closed the schools and they transformed them. They removed standards. They removed honors classes. Look at Northern California, the Sequoia district, where they removed honors math, honors English, and really dumbed down education in some of the top schools in the country. It's really terrifying.
So what you're saying is they're making these kids into their own image.
Yeah.
And not giving them a broad education. It's indoctrination is what you're saying.
And white guilt. And terrible white guilt. I mean, they're basically teaching these children that this country is a bad country, that it was born out of original sin, right? Like this, it's irredeemable. And they're teaching these kids not to be proud to be Americans and to be captured by race segregation. I mean, they're teaching classes where they're segregating Black kids from white kids. It's kind of taking our country back and our schools back to a time that nobody wants to go back to. I mean, it's really shocking.
And then in addition to teachers, the teachers union is also made up of healthcare workers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, the nurses' strike in New York that just happened recently was all orchestrated by Randi Weingarten and the same actors. The union is a conflagration of other unions.
So it sounds like it's a funnel, is what you're saying,
yeah.
Right? Like they're getting money from the teachers and from the healthcare workers, and then they're taking that money and they're doing what with it?
Supporting their candidates who are going to help them negotiate their contracts too. So it's very circuitous. It really requires a lot of reading and an in-depth understanding of what they stand for. They're pretty clear, the unions, that they, stand for equity. Creating equity is like a synonym for communism, Marxism, right? They're basically saying that instead of giving everybody an equal opportunity at a shot, which is what this country was founded on, they want to level the playing field so that nobody really achieves anything, that they get to decide.
And this is very personal for you because, as you said in the documentary, the school was your shot at the American dream.
And I'd like to go back for a minute because I think this is an important point. A few months ago, we had our second No Kings parade that happened in New York and around the country. You've had the anti-ICE protests. They all seem very organic, but actually most of them are organized by the teachers' unions. Randi Weingarten organized the No Kings Day parades, and it's supposed to be a protest against Trump. But the only kings I can see here are the teachers' unions. They're unelected bureaucrats that are basically trying to meddle in our elections. So yes, now I'll answer your question. Yes, school was very important to me. I came here in 1977. It was the winter of 77. I was 6. I didn't speak a word of English. And I remember my mother went to the school and asked the principal if I should be held back and go to kindergarten or if I should go to first grade in the middle of the year. And the principal said she can keep up. Young kids can learn language pretty quickly. And there I was thrust into it. And it was great. I wasn't home, with my parents. My parents went to work right away. I was with other kids. I learned really quickly. I got to understand, what my surroundings were. I got grounded. And I think about what would have happened if I had come in 2020 when schools were closed and, lived in this tiny 1-bedroom apartment with my parents. And my parents couldn't go to work and we were all isolated in this little powder keg, right? How tragic that would have been. I don't know how and when I would have recovered.
Right. So like I say, it's very personal to you. It's not just about your kids. It's about your memory and your story of what happened to you when you came here. This is just fascinating. Again, 15 Days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures. It's available on multiple platforms, and really I want everyone to see it. What is next then for Natalya? What do you have on tap?
So I have a film that's about to come out. It's called Uncancellable. And it's a spinoff. No, I'm kidding. Well, it's kind of a spinoff in a way because one of the characters, one of the moms that I interviewed for 15 days, her name is Maud Marin.
Whom you just mentioned.
Yes.
You invoked a moment ago.
I did, yes. And Maud is pretty well known here in New York City and even nationally because she was one of the first parents who spoke out about DEI and race training on school boards. And for that, she got removed from her job at the Legal Aid Society. She was one of the open schools parents here, anti-mask parents, has pretty much stood, in my opinion, on the right issue of all these things. But probably what's given her most notoriety is that she introduced Resolution 248, which was demanding a look at the wisdom of having boys play on girls' sports teams here in New York City public schools. And it was a resolution that passed 2 years ago. And ever since then, she's been plagued with, transphobe and all sorts of names, and activists showed up at all of her school board meetings after that resolution passed, and she ultimately lost her election and she's no longer on the school board, which is a loss to New York City. But anyway, she also ran for Manhattan DA against Alvin Bragg and lost, but did very well in the election. And so we made a film for Palladium Pictures about her trials and tribulations on the campaign trail and what the school board meetings were like.
Well, I can't wait to see it. Is she going to run again?
I don't know.
Okay.
You have her on and ask her.
Stay tuned. I would love to because she's really a force of nature. Well, in any event, Natalya, we just want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of the One Way Ticket Show. And we wish you every success with 15 Days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures. You can watch it on Google Play, Amazon, Apple TV, and YouTube as well. And we'll have info about Natalya Murakhver on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, as well as on the YouTube channel, on the podcast platforms, wherever you're consuming this content. We're going to have info about Natalya, about her organization, Restore Childhood, her Substack, you name it. It's going to be there, so do check it all out indeed. And of course, if you're watching us on the YouTube channel, do make sure you subscribe by ringing the bell so you never miss an episode of great conversation like we've just had, I believe, with Natalya. And of course, do follow the show and me on all social media. Just search for The One Way Ticket Show and search for yours truly, Stephen Shalowitz. It's so easy. And if you'd like to shoot me an email, do so at stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Share your one-way ticket destination of choice, or let's even arrange a call-in chat because I'm always up for a great conversation. Meantime, it's a wrap for this edition of the One Way Ticket Show. For Natalya Murakhver and the entire crew, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and we'll see you next time.